Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Target Sheep webinar of 2020 presented via Virbac. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name's Alex, and I'm the product manager for the sheep parasiticides range at Virbac, and I'll be your moderator for this evening's webinar. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Tim Elliott on board to present on the importance of a second summer drench. Also with us tonight, we have Dr. George Cox, who is our technical services manager from Virbac, who will assist throughout the evening. A bit of housekeeping before we do get started. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you are having any technical issues, please call or text the number on your screen, and I'll do my best to help you out. If you do have any questions for Tim or George, please type them into the question box provided, and we'll address them at the end of the session. Please be as clear as possible in asking any questions so that we can give you the best possible answers. Anyway, back into it. As I said, tonight we are joined by Dr. Tim Elliott. Tim is a researcher with a particular interest in production animal parasitology and drug resistance. Tim has worked with many pharmaceutical companies, universities, veterinarians, and government departments to help reduce the impact of parasites on animal production. He has experience designing parasite control programs for sheep farmers in the New England region of New South Wales, where drench resistance is highly prevalent, especially right now following the rain the region has finally received. Tim completed his PhD at La Trobe University, studying the prevalence of liver fluke in the Gippsland Dairy region of Victoria. And Tim's work has been published in internationally renowned journals, and he has presented his work all around Australia for scientific audiences and farmer groups. Before I pass over to Tim, we do have a few poll questions to go through. These questions will help us get a better understanding of who you are and what information would be most beneficial to you. So they are anonymous as well, so please be honest with your response. So I'll put the first poll question up now for you. And if you have any issues asking questions, it is in the tab that should be visible on your screen. So just click that little arrow there on the side and put your questions in there, and we'll address them at the end of the session. All right, first poll question. It's a simple one. You should be able to see it now. Which state are you from? Responses are coming in. I'll give it 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Great, thanks guys. And the responses should be on your screen now. So, we've got 58% from New South Wales and the ACT and 37% from Victoria and Tasmania. So those states who have, in a lot of areas, received a lot of rain. So a lot of interest in this topic, obviously, which is fantastic. Second poll question should be launching on your screen now. Are you a fat lamb producer or a wool producer? Got 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Great, thanks guys. That'll be on your screen now. So 53% lamb producers or fat lamb producers and 41% have a mix. Third question. Are you currently looking to restock? Got 3 more seconds, guys. 3, 2, 1. So the majority not looking to restock at this stage, 26% still unsure, and 16% are a yes. Next question on your screen now. Got 3 more seconds, guys. 3, 2, 1. So most of you look to purchase your stock in spring, a few in summer, and some in autumn as well. Very few self-replacing blocks out there. A couple more questions, guys, and we'll get into it. Is avoiding worm resistance important to you? Three more seconds. 3, 2, 1. And it's an obvious answer here. And good awareness for resistance, obviously, because 89% of you said yes, it's very important, which is great to hear. We have 2 more questions. An important one for this session. Did you give a first summer drench? Three more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Beautiful. And yeah, the right response there, 80% saying yes, they did give a first summer drench. So you're definitely in the right spot. And final question. What was the last drench you used? Was it Tridectin, Zolvix or Zolvix Plus, StarTech, Abamectin Triple, or other? Okay, 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. So 41% used other, so either a single active or capsules or another drench. 23% used Tridectin, with 18% using Abamectin Triple, and 9% between Zolvix and StarTech. Great, thanks for that, guys. Really appreciate your responses there, and that will help Tim run the session that he's about to begin right now. So without further ado, I will pass over to Tim.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Alex. Can you hear me there, Alex?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yep, beautiful. Rightio. I'll kick off. Well, thanks everyone for coming in and having a listen to this one today. So the main point of this webinar is to make people think about whether you actually need to have a crack at that second summer drench, because we've discussed the importance of the first summer drench and how that's a strategic drench where you're trying to minimize the amount of contamination going over your summertime, which then flows into your autumn and your spring. But the second summer drench, which used to be pretty much a staple back in the day, is more of a tactical drench because it's very much on season. So that's what we're going to hopefully get through today with 3 questions. No, you're not going to do a summer drench. Maybe I should do a fecal ecan, or yes, I need to do a second summer drench. So as Alex was saying, a bit of my background. I was born and raised in Armidale, sheep and cattle farming background, fine wool merinos and beef cattle. I then got into research probably nearly 20 years ago now, and that was the first thing that really spiked my interest in parasitology, because I realised what an issue it is and how it's going to get worse and worse. Went over to New Zealand, worked there for a while doing the same sort of thing on drench resistance, and then did a PhD in liver fluke. So that beautiful picture down there, I'll just change my pointer. I spent a lot of time pulling livers out of dead cows and pulling the liver fluke out and doing testing on those. During all that time, I've been trying to work out effective ways that we can try and control drench-resistant parasites through effective use of drenches and just management. Management is one of the biggest keys. So that's my background, doing consultancy work at the moment, and as Virbac is paying me to do this sort of stuff, I'm not here to recommend products for Virbac or anyone else. All I'm here is trying to create a bit of awareness, and hopefully people use the right drench at the right time. So one of the key things is, why do we drench sheep? Because I don't think I've ever met anyone who actually enjoys drenching sheep, especially if you've got a big mob of 70-kilo crossbred ewes. It's not a fun job. But the main reason why we do it is for animal welfare, because we know that parasites in big numbers and certain types of parasites will kill sheep. So we do it from that point of view, and we do it for production, because without production, we're not going to be very good farmers. And if we get production, we get profit, because every time you drench, you should always be thinking of the drench as an investment, not a cost. But if you do it wrong, and you use the wrong drench, use the wrong dose rate, use it at the wrong time, that's when it does become an expense and not an investment. So hopefully these sort of things will make people think a little bit more before they just reach for a drench gun to go and drench their sheep. You have to ask a few more questions first. So one of the big areas with barber's pole, small brown stomach worm, black scour, all those sort of parasites, is most of the time they're sitting out here on the pasture. So the eggs get deposited out from the sheep. The sheep's walking along with adult worms sitting in its stomach. They get deposited out in the feces, and they sit on the pasture. Now, the biggest thing that will encourage them to hatch is moisture and temperature. And as you'll see in a little bit, that's one thing we have had recently. And for barber's pole, they like it a little bit warmer. Temperatures above 18 degrees. We use scour worms, which is your small brown stomach worm, black scour worm, more prevalent in southern Australia, mainly because of that temperature difference. They like it a little bit cooler. But the important thing is, you only need 10 to 15 mil of rain to get these guys to start hatching. Because once the moisture gets right in these little fecal pats here, and the temperature's right, they hatch on the pasture, and from in 7 days, they can go from an egg to a larval stage called the L3. This is the infectious stage. The sheep comes along and ingests that worm, or those worms sitting on the blade of grass, goes into the animal, and then 21 days later, so 3 weeks later, those little larvae have turned into adult parasites and are laying eggs back out again. So the whole life cycle can be done within 4 weeks in ideal conditions. Now, ideal conditions is what we've been having recently. So after a year of a cracking drought, if you look across to what we have going on at the moment, where we've had long periods of dry, but this is the forecast for January and pretty much what we had. So pretty much the whole eastern area, or southeastern area of Australia, which is where most of you guys are from, looking at, because it's mostly New South Wales, Vic and Tas, has been receiving some good rainfall. Now remember, we only need 15 mil of rain to get these guys to stimulate to hatch. We've been getting some cracking rainfall here. This is really going to fire up the worms. The other key thing is, if we look across to February, so I can get it to work, we've had the same thing. We've had rainfall, and in these areas we've had quite a bit of rainfall. So now we've had nearly 2 months of good rainfall, and when we're in summer we get nice warm days. So we've been getting good temperatures and high moisture. Now that is just a perfect way to hatch worms. When I used to grow worms as a researcher, I'd grow them artificially so I could infect other sheep to do the testing of chemicals on them. I'd put them in an incubator that was nice and moist. I'd moisten up all the feces with vermiculite, and then I put them in an incubator at about 25 degrees for a week. We've been having some beautiful days at 20 to 29 degrees for nearly a month or two now. So there's going to be a lot of hatching on that pasture at the moment. And that's a key thing of why we need to think about this second summer drench. Because if the drought had continued and all of the southeastern Australia was as dry as a chip, I could almost put my hand on my heart and say there'd be very few worms out there. But now with these weather conditions, it's going to be a bit of an issue. So where are the worms? We know that they're hatching on the pasture, but where do they mainly hang out? And the important thing is when you've got your blade of grass sitting up here, the parasites only go up maximum of 5 centimeters, so quite low to the ground, because they're only little tiny parasites sitting in a droplet of water or in some dew. They don't have long legs. They can't climb all the way up to the tops of the swards of grass. So it's very important that they're all in this area here. Now, the other double-edged sword to this is when we've been coming off some dry conditions, a lot of our pasture is very short at the moment. It's very short and it's very green. And that's the exact type of pasture that the livestock will go looking for. So when you've got this area here, lush green feed, high moisture and good temperatures, it's perfect for letting those little worms hatch. Also, weather does kill the larvae. And as you see here, low temperatures actually makes the larvae survive longer. So this is how long it takes for the worms to die. So at 10 degrees, it would take up to 150 days for 90% of those worms to die. Where at high temperature, they die a lot quicker. But at the moment, we've got high temperatures. We've also got high humidity, which means we're getting a lot of egg hatch going on there as well. So those larval numbers are constantly being re-established. So at this point in time, we're in very, very high risk time for infection of worms. So the whole point of why we're running this sort of webinar and what people want to get the answer is, should you drench? So the first thing I'd be thinking about doing is, say you've had your first decent lot of rain. I know around in New England, we started getting some nice rain around Christmas. Some places further south may have been early January. So you should look at doing a fecal egg count, so a FEC, about 3 to 4 weeks after you've had your first decent rainfall event. And what this will show is that any worms that have hatched from that nice rainfall event that have been picked up by those sheep, they'll start laying eggs at about that 3 to 4 week mark. We say 4 weeks because it gives you a bit of wiggle room. Because remember, a fecal egg count, when you get an egg count back and says you've got 400 EPG or eggs per gram in there, it's an indication of the worms that were picked up 3+ weeks ago. If they've been picking up worms 2 weeks ago, because of that time period, that 21 days that it takes for those worms to grow up, we can't detect that. So the first thing I'd be doing is doing a fecal egg count, because that'll tell you whether you definitely do or don't need to drench yet. And don't be lulled into a false sense of security. If you do a fecal egg count now and it comes back very, very low, remember we've still got that 3-week gap. There might be new stuff coming through. So even if you do one now, consider another one in another 3 weeks if it's still pretty low. If you're about to lamb you use, I'd be drenching very quickly, because it's one of the few times that I'd be quite happy to drench sheep without a fecal egg count, because once a ewe has lambed, or just before she lambs, she has a big immune response drop. She lambs, you can't go near her for at least a couple of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks minimum, because you've got ewes lambing in that paddock. You can't go in there and muster. So if you have a big heap of worms go through them, you're in a lot of trouble. The other thing you need to do is because, you know, parasitology, we design drenching programs for districts, areas, and that sort of stuff, but it's very much particular for each farm. Look at the pasture. If you've got that short green pick coming up, that's that high risk area that we're talking about, that first 5 centimeters. Or if the grass has got away from you because maybe you've sort of destocked a little bit and it's all running up the head, then it's a lower risk, because if the animals are going to be grazing a bit further up the sward. Your grazing management. How long have those sheep been in that paddock? Have they been in that same paddock since November? Have you only just put them in there? If you only just put them in there after it rained and there was no sheep in that paddock for 3 or 4 months before, there's probably a very low risk of that paddock getting those animals infected. So these are the sort of things you need to think about when you're going to think about drenching. The other one that's going to be very, very interesting coming out of the drought conditions is the condition of your animals. The condition score plays a huge role into whether those animals will become wormy. A poor little hogget that's in a condition score 2, doing it tough, will pick up worms at the drop of a hat, compared to a condition score 3 or 4 that's a big fatty that's done really well. And it's just because they've got a good immune system. They're doing well. If all the nutritional requirements are being met, they can ward off that infection. So if you've got short green feed and poor animals, it's a bit of a red flag that you may have a worm issue coming up. And the other one is, okay, so you've done your fecal egg count. We know we need to drench. What are we going to use? Now, the only thing I would say is use one that works, and only you can really know that. But make sure it's not the same drench that you used for your first summer drench. You should always mix them up, or use a different drench and use a combination product. And I'll come to combinations a bit later on, while we're sort of steering away from single active drenches. The other thing people will need to think about as well is scouring animals. Now, it may not be worms that are going to cause your animals to scour at this point in time, because of these high rainfall and the short green feed, the scour can be caused from nutrition. Could be just a lot of green feed just going straight through and it's running at the back end. So just because you see a scouring animal, don't go straight away reaching for the drench gun. Because if it hasn't been running on wormy paddock or any other reason, just get a fecal egg count first, because you could be walking in and drenching for no reason. But if you also get animals that are scouring, watch out for flies, because these conditions are fantastic for hatching the blowfly that's going to give you animals fly strike. And you can't really use your long-acting based products for fly control now, so you may have to use a shorter acting one, or you might consider crutching a bit earlier or shearing a bit earlier. So now moving on to resistance, this is where things start to get a bit interesting, because we've got data here from 2009 to 2012. So looking back on all the old data, or the old drenches, the whites, which are the BZs, clears, which are the lavanozoles, these are all pretty old. So this is the proportion of farms that had resistance to these types of parasites. Very high numbers. So a lot of these farms, majority, have got resistance to this class of chemical. But as we move further down to the newer ones, the mectins here, where you get the earlier ones to the later ones, the early ones are failing, but they go to the newer ones, they're getting better. And then you come into the combinations, and you'll see when combinations are used, a lot less properties have problems with that. So the combinations are working a lot better. So if you're ever going to use a drench, which you will, I'd always recommend using combinations, because think of a combination drench as, instead of using a single active where all you're doing is punching the worm in the nose once, if you use a three-way drench, you punch him in the nose, you punch him in the guts, and you hit him in the back as well. You've got to come from 3 different angles to really make sure you control them. And then we'll move on to some data. So this is more recent data from 2018 and 19 that we were doing in the New England region, so up around Armidale, which is pretty much the home of resistance. We've got some horrible barber's pole resistance here. So moxidectin, pretty much been a staple. I wouldn't know many farmers that haven't used a moxidectin in their control program. Most of the farms here, the 11 farms, no one got over that. Only one got over that 95%, 98% efficacy, which is what we classify as an effective drench. Everyone else was pretty much gone. You see, it's only getting 10% kills. Some it was negative. So big problems. But all of a sudden, when you mix those actives, so the moxidectin with the levamisole and BZ, all of a sudden you get a lot better control. So it's that 3-way punch of trying to really make sure you smash your worms, because leaving all these worms here has a twofold effect. A, your drench didn't work, so your drenches all of a sudden become a cost instead of an investment, but you haven't controlled your worms. So those worms that are left there are still laying their eggs. They're still going to infect your animals. They're going to contaminate your pasture, and they're going to spread more resistance. So it's very important that if you're going to use a drench, make sure you use one that's highly effective. So now you've decided, okay, I've done my fecal egg count. I probably do need to do a second summer drench because the egg count is X. I can't really say what egg count to drench at, because every area is different for what egg count they need to drench at. And the main reason for that is, it depends on the type of worm you have. You'll drench at a much lower egg count for your scale worm, say Osteotargia, like the small brown stomach worm or black scale, compared to barber's pole. Because barber's pole will lay 10,000 eggs a day, where your black scale might only lay 500, 200 eggs a day. So you've done your second summer drench, a drench chip. Now it's going to cost you $50, but it's a well worth the investment. So after you've drenched, 14 days later, come back to that same mob of sheep and collect some samples. Send them off to the lab and get them counted. So you've done that, they come back and they've got a count. And let's say the count is an eggs per gram of 100. What does this mean? Well, one thing it does mean, it means that you didn't control 100% of the worms in there, but we can't tell from that whether it controlled 40%, 50%, 80%, because the biggest thing is, it depends on how high the egg count was at the start. If at the start, when you drenched those animals on day 0, the egg count was 1,000 and now it's 100, it means your efficacy was 90%. But if on the day you drenched, it was 200 and now it's 100, it means your drench was only 50. So it just gives you a bit of a confidence knowing that your drench was effective. So the other way I've sort of been thinking about it, because you can have a drench that's 70% effective and you will get a clinical response. You can have animals that are sick, say from barber's pole, they've got a bottle jaw, they're not looking very well. You bring them in, you drench them. A week later, you can say, look at this, they've cleared up, they've got more color in their gums, the bottle jaw's gone away, I've done a really good job. But that drench might have only been 70% effective. So you've knocked out enough worms to take away the clinical signs. But the only way we can really detect on whether it's 70%, 80%, 100% is by doing this drench check, the fecal egg count. The way I've been sort of using it as an analogy is if you're going to sow a paddock down to pasture, a crop or anything like that, so you come in with your berm spray, you put out 2 litres of Roundup to the hectare, spray, and then 3 weeks later you come back and 30% of the grass is still sitting there green looking at you. Are you going to be very happy? You'd say no. You go, well, hang on, I should have got 100% kill. What's going on? So you'd go back, you'd look at your Roundup drum. Did I have the wrong mix? Was it out of date? Did something wrong? Was the boom spray not calibrated hard water? Because you've got that visual sign that can tell you that something was wrong. With parasites in sheep, we don't have that luxury. So drench check for $50 is cheap as chips, and it can really save you along the way. Ideally, people should have a fecal egg count reduction test, which is where you test maybe 6 or 7 different drenches so you know what drenches work. But this is the good way just to raise a bit of awareness for it. So to summarize this sort of talk, I think about worm control, and if you're going to go drench, of thinking of it as a rifle. I mean, it's called a drench gun. Think of a gun. If your sheep are getting attacked by foxes or wild dogs or anything like that, you're going to go out and you're going to go and try and shoot them, say, but you're not going to take out a little rubbish 22 with a subsonic ammunition that doesn't shoot very well. Because if you do that, all you're going to do is waste your time. You're not going to try and you're not going to hit the foxes or the dogs, or if you do, they're just going to get away. You're going to go out there with a high-powered rifle, a 223 with a good scope and a good spotlight, because if you're going to take the shot, you want to make sure you're killing what you're trying to do. Think of the exact same way with your parasites. There's no point going out there and spooking all your worms by giving them a rubbish drench that doesn't work. You've wasted your time and you've wasted your money. So think of it that way. If you're going to have a shot at them, make sure it's done well. Also, whoop.
Sorry, I just slipped there. Sorry, Tim.
Yep. It's all right. And whenever you think about this, when the contamination that you've got coming into your autumn and your winter, whatever you carry over now, that's the worms you're going to have to deal with later on. So that's why this is important. And if you control your worms during the summer period, if you keep them to a lower level, what happens in your autumn and winter should be to a lesser extent the impact of those guys. So this is talking more of a winter rainfall area or a non-seasonal rainfall area. And you always got to keep asking questions, because just because you used to do it for the last 3 years doesn't mean that the same system is still working, because the problems are always going to change. Parasites change, and we just need to try and stay one step ahead of them. You're never going to get rid of them, but the biggest thing is we need to control them down to a level that they're no longer impacting our stock, because the whole point of it is we're trying to make money out of this, and we make money by having healthy animals. So that's pretty much it from me, Alex. Yeah. There been any questions or anything pop up, or?
Not at the moment, guys. Thank you, Tim. First of all, that was fantastic, guys. Just a reminder, yeah, please do add your questions to the question box provided. While you're doing that, I'll just share my screen. Okay, should be back with me now, Tim.
Yep.
All right, great. Yeah, guys, as I said, please add your questions to the question box there. Now, before we do get into the questions, we do have a special promotion for you guys, just for you guys who attended tonight. For those who attend any Target Sheep webinar, we are giving away a $40 Coles Myer gift card for any purchases of any Tridectin 10-litre pack. Claims must be made within 2 months of the Target Sheep event. You can redeem the gift card by emailing myself using a special reference code you'll receive in a follow-up email that you'll receive 24 hours from now. All you have to do is quote the code in the email and attach a proof of purchase, and we'll send you the gift card. Yeah, and you'll receive that email within 24 hours. Moving on to questions now. Okay, we've got one question come in, and it's about your favourite, Tim. It's about fluke. Have you seen any liver fluke at the moment?
I haven't, but I've sort of been stepped out of the diagnostic lab for a while. It's if people have done their spring drench and use an effective drench, the numbers should be pretty low. But yeah, this rain will be. It's not going to affect the liver fluke, but what it's going to do is it's going to really fire up the intermediate host for the liver fluke, the snail. So this is where we could get really stung in autumn. Is there's going to be a lot more of those snails around that can transmit the infection of liver fluke. So technically, most of the time, this is not the high point for liver fluke infection, but it may become more evident because there's going to be a lot more of these little snails around at the moment. So
great, thanks, Tim. We've got another question come through, guys. Please send them all through now. So the next question is, should I use a long-acting product as my second summer drench?
I'd rather see long-acting products being used in a high-risk time when you're getting the most amount of your parasites coming through that are putting the pressure on your animals, because that's when the long-acting products work best, I think. So I wouldn't be using them at this point in time, because I'd save them for the higher risk times in the higher risk animals. George, would you agree with that one?
Yes, Tim, it depends on where you are. That's very true in humongous areas. If you go to the winter rainfall areas, your high challenge might be coming up, and you could consider a long-acting for a pre-lambing drench as well.
Yep. Yeah, so it depends on where your risk period is. If you're coming into it, then hit them now.
Great, no, thanks, guys. It doesn't have to be related to a second summer drench, guys. Any questions relating to parasitology or drenching? We have George and Tim there. We do have time to address your questions now, so please get them through. We do have another one. Do I need to do an FEC on all my mobs of sheep?
I'd sort of use a sentinel mob of sheep at the start. So say you've got a mob of hoggets or something like that you know have done it tough. They've been on that short pasture, and if anyone's going to get wormy, it'll be that mob. You should know what paddocks have got the most amount of worms on your place, or have a good idea, and select those high risk animals. So your hoggets, rams are always good because they're pretty useless for worms because they only got one job. So rams will always get worms. So pick that mob and get a fecal egg count done on those guys. If they come back very, very low or don't require a drench, I wouldn't worry about doing fecal egg counts on anyone else. But if they do, then you could think about doing some of, say, your weathers or your dry ewes or something like that a bit later on. So don't go all out. Use the sentinel mob at the start just to see whether you actually need to do some more fecal egg count testing later on in the other mobs.
Great, thanks, Tim. Here's another one. What is your trigger point for an FEC to make it worthwhile drenching in ewes in condition score 2.5? The bottom bit has been cut off, and lambs. I think that might be the end of the question, I hope.
Okay, very much depends on the type of parasite you're dealing with. If you're further down south from the New England, where your main worms are your scour worms, so the small brown stomach worm and black scour, that could only be a couple hundred EPG, and it also depends on whether those ewes batter lamb or are lactating or stuff like that. But it really depends on your area. Yeah, I can't really give you an exact answer because it's really site specific to where you are. Where Barber's pole in this sort of area, we wouldn't look at doing anything until about 600 eggs per gram or maybe even higher. But scour worms, you obviously drop that down a bit just because of the sheer volume of eggs that Barber's pole can put out. It's so much more than the scour worms. But if they're 2.5, they're not too bad. So they should be able to maintain an infection. But was there a last bit about lambs, Ed? Did they have lambs at foot or?
Yeah, I just said and lambs.
And lambs?
Yeah.
Lambs, you'd probably go a little bit lower with your egg count just because their immune system's pretty rubbish. They can't really fight off that infection. And if anyone's going to go down, you'd be a lamb. So you dose them at a lower eggs per gram, I would anyway. Whether that's 300, 200, as I said, it depends on what's the dominant worm on your farm.
Great, no, thanks for that. Hopefully that answers your question. I didn't miss anything there. The next question is, can poor timing be just as bad as using a non-effective drench?
Spot on, yep. Because if you come in and you drench them when there's no worms there, well, what's the point? It's completely utterly pointless going in there if the worms haven't had enough time to actually get into your animals. There's no point drenching your animals. And I know how often I've heard people say, "Oh, I'm going down to the coast for a week or two. I'll drench them before I go." And I think it makes them feel good that they've done something. But if they had no worms in there, the worms don't care whether you've gone to the coast. It just makes the person feel better that they think they've done all right. So yeah, mistiming is probably one of the biggest issues of the whole lot. It's like the right drench at the wrong time is pretty ordinary because you've just wasted your time. That's where the fecal egg count is. For $50, it's a bargain.
Brilliant. No, thanks, Tim. Next question. Did you mean to use a different drench for first summer? I'm just going to have to. We use a combination, have a program to change annually for 4 years after doing a drench resistance test, and that's in brackets.
Okay, so you use the same drench.
So did you use a different summer drench? Yeah, did you use a different drench for your first summer drench?
Yeah, I'd use a different summer drench, definitely. But if you've used, say, a triple combo for your first summer drench, I'd come in with something different. They can have one of the same actives, but they should have some different actives in there as well, especially over that summer period, because we're going to have low refugia, like a low parasite pressure on the pasture, so that if we keep selecting for those worms to survive, it's the quicker way to get resistance. I know some people are saying just use combinations all the time and then we have to deal with it later on, but I'd rather see multiple drenches that are combinations with different combinations used as an integrated parasite control program. George, what do you think?
I totally agree with you that we have to use everything that works on our property.
Yep. I think if all we do is keep using something until it falls over, then we just put more pressure on the ones that get left later on, and then they fall over quicker. So yeah, I'd rather see if you've got 3 or 4 that you know are working well, keep mixing it around with those guys and keep the worms guessing along the way. Don't wait for that one to fail, then you only get left with 2, then one fails and you get left with 1. That was my sort of idea of how to try and control it.
There is a second part of this question, a bit of a spelling error, but I think it is meant to say we use a combination and have a program to change annually every 4 years. And this is after doing a drench resistance test. So I think the question is changing every 4 years enough? And I could be wrong, but that's how I read it.
I guess it depends on how often you're drenching as well. Yeah, that's a bit of a tough one without actually knowing how often and what type of livestock you got there. But if you're only drenching,
if you have any more, sorry, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, if you're only drenching twice a year, sort of thing, it's probably not that big of a deal. But if you're drenching more often, which a lot of people are because we're running our animals more and more and pushing them a bit further, I'd be a bit worried about that.
And guys, if you have any questions for us, or if we're not answering your questions well enough, you can email me as well, and I'll pass those questions on to Tim as well.
Yep.
The next question, Tim, starts with a compliment. Great stuff, Tim. Is it not also beneficial to control burdens in winter to reduce the spring-summer challenge?
Yep, spot on. Whatever infection you're dealing with at this point in time has been deposited on your pasture previously. So the summer drench is more of that non-seasonal rainfall, the winter rainfall, because that's where you have the least amount of parasites on your pastures during the summer, where when you come to summer rainfall areas, the least amount of parasites we have on pasture is in winter. So yeah, it's always the best control of their parasites when they're the least, the amount on their pasture. That doesn't really make sense, does it? Yeah. Yeah, when you're trying to control your parasite, the whole idea of the summer drenching is because there's going to be very little infection going through once the heat hits. That's why if you knock them out there's not much carries over into your autumn.
Hopefully that answers your question. The next one, is there any resistance to Moxie LAI considering the results on the Moxie short acting?
Whether you get resistant to LA, yep. The first thing that happens, say you're dealing with a population of worms that are mectin resistant, is you won't get the period of persistency with your long-acting products. I think Moxie LA gets about 91 days. I think the Barber's Pole, that'll slowly creep back. You might only get 60 days, you might only get 40 days, you might get 30 days. So that's what it sort of happens there, is you just don't get those longevity out of your long-acting.
Yeah.
That's
so
why
what's your recommendation around that, if that is, I guess, a fear that the persistency might not be there?
Yep. Prime it with an unrelated drench, coming with something else at the same time as you're giving the injection. And then, depending on where you are, if you're in an area that's got lots and lots of resistance to mectins, I'd say at day 30 and 60, get to a fecal egg count. But if you're in an area that's not too bad, at day 50 days after you've given that drench, get a fecal egg count done, because that'll give you a very good indication about how that drench is performing. Because if at day 50 you're getting eggs coming through, it means you're going to have a few issues going on, and you're not going to get that full period of efficacy out of that product. So yeah, they're a very good product to use, but you just got to use them wisely.
Yep. No, great, thanks for that. This next question has mentioned their name, so I'll assume I can mention it to everyone else. Hi, Kevin from New England. Is there value to be had from using a long-acting injectable in my lambs to keep them healthy and going ahead for the remainder of the growing season up here?
Yes, but it's all very dependent on how well your Moxie works, the condition that your lambs are going to be in, and whether you prime, that sort of stuff. So when Moxie works well, it's a very good way to control the parasites, because you get that extra period. But yeah, it's very much dependent on your farm, and I'd find out first how well your straight oral Moxie is working by itself. Or if you do it, do those checks along the way when you do your long acting.
Just going through the questions here, Tim, there's quite a few coming through. I think this one's in response to the query on the LAI. So perfect sense, therefore long-acting, better placed in winter, question mark.
When it's low burden, no, I'd much rather use it in a high burden time. George, would you like to jump in that one?
Definitely when you're facing high challenge, you don't want to be using a long-acting product on a time when there's very low challenge. That's when you'll select for resistance quicker.
Yep.
Okay. God, there's a lot of questions here. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to go through them. Other than drenching, what other health considerations should I consider?
Beautiful. Yeah, the thing with parasite control, it's never just worm problem, solution, a drench gun. I hate using the word holistic because it makes you sound like a hippie, but it is. Everything's integrated. The way you run your animals, the condition of your animals, the grazing, all has a huge impact. One of the best drenches and best ways you control parasites is with the fence. By not letting them go and eating those larvae that have been deposited there previously. Nutrition's huge. Big, fat, healthy animals are really good. Co-grazing is another way to do it. One of the best animals to control sheep worms is cattle, because the cattle can go through, they can act like a vacuum cleaner. They'll ingest those sheep worms, but they don't take in the cattle, so they get passed out. There's other ways you can do it. There's vaccines for worms now you can use for Barber's Pole anyway. There's fungi you can feed the animals that will stop the eggs hatching, or they'll kill the larvae when they come out. So there's lots of different ways to do it. But yeah, you just got to make sure you work it on your farm, because your farm is very, very unique. Because even though your neighbor is on very similar dirt, the way you manage your livestock and your pastures and your animals can be very, very different, which gives your worm control a different way of doing it. But yeah, don't just use drenches as your only way to control parasites. Use nature, use biology, because that's what the parasites do.
Great, thanks for that, Tim. There's a lot of questions here, guys. This is fantastic. Just trying to filter through them. Should we consider using a dual active short acting drench with a Moxie LAI?
George, you want to go that one?
That's definitely an option. That's where Tim mentioned the primer. So what you basically do is you make sure that you remove as much or as many as possible of the parasites in the animal at the time you drench, and that will basically give you back the moxidectin persistency as well.
Thanks for that, George. Next one isn't a question. It's it's a statement from our friends at Wormboss. And they clarify by saying not a question, but if you are doing a drench check, you can jump onto the Wormboss website and use the drench efficacy calculator. You put in the efficacy of the single actives you tested and find the efficacy of the combo you used on the farm. And we are all fans of Wormboss. Any comments on that on the Wormboss calculator, guys?
Yeah, use Wormboss. Wormboss got so much information. It's fantastic. It's all there.
Fantastic. Let me just see if there's any other ones really quickly. What are your thoughts on drenching into a drought lot?
Yep, drenching into a drought lot. Basically, you want to make sure that you use a very, very effective drench, because the last thing you want to do is leave worms in those animals, because if you're going to give them a full feedlot ration, you're putting a lot of money into those animals. You don't want to have parasites in there that are basically going to be chewing away the nutrition that you're feeding your animals. So you want to make sure you hit them with something very, very good. But depending on what you're trying to lot feed is crucial as well. If you're trying to finish off some lambs, so you just got some crossbred lambs, you want to put that last 10 kilos on them, it's going to limit you to what drenches you can use. And it's not because of what drench is good or not. It's got to do with the withhold periods and your export slaughter intervals. So yeah, whenever you're going to lot feed or anything like that, make sure you drench them very well before you put them in there. The other thing that I've seen with lot feeding of sheep as well is contain them into a pretty small area. There is DPI recommendations, I just can't remember off the top of my head, but don't give them too much of a paddock, because what I've seen happen is if they have a fairly large paddock that they can all go and sit in, for a month or two when it's been dry, they graze it, there's no pasture left, they're eating the ration, but when it gets rain, all the grass can shoot back up. And because you've had those animals sitting in a high concentration, pooping out lots and lots of eggs, if there's eggs still in them, you can all of a sudden get this big storm of worms hit very, very quickly. And people will ring me up saying, but I've got worms in my feedlot, how can they be getting them? And it's exactly that way, because they're picking up that high contaminated pasture that's just shot out of the ground, and the sheep, they just try and smash it because that's what they're after.
Great, thanks, Tim. I've just lost the questions. Look, two more left. Let me just get back in there. Guys, last chance for any more questions. This one, so it looks like I've purchased stock from New South Wales to Vic. What's the best way to assure you minimise introducing the problem of worms?
Quarantine drenching. I think
that's yes, that's next month. We'll get onto that in a second.
Yeah, I think when you look at resistance, and as we've discussed it here, resistance on a closed herd takes time. It takes generations for that gene to pass through for selection and that sort of stuff. It can take years and years and years, but you can get it overnight by a guy in a blue singlet that turns up with a truckload of sheep and drops them off to your farm. So whenever any new stock turn up on your farm, you should treat them as if they've got every bad parasite disease or anything like that known to man. With this quarantine guidelines on how to actually drench a sheep whenever they come off, so quickly minimum of 4 different actives, hold them in the yards for a couple of days, and then put them out onto dirty paddocks, because you want them to pick up your native worms, because your worms are special, and then do that day 14 drench check to make sure that they actually did clean them out. But when we do the quarantine drenching webinar, we'll be a lot more specific and a bit more guided with what we say there. But yeah, it's crucial, and there's going to be a lot of livestock moving around the place because of these wet weather we're getting at the moment. So don't import someone else's problems to your farm.
Mm-hmm. And I'll give you all the details to that webinar in a little bit for those who are interested as well. We've got 2 more questions here, Tim. We'll probably have to wrap up after that. No, we've got 3. What is the best vaccine for use with a quarantine drench for introduced stock?
George, do you want to jump on that one? You're more of the immunology guy than me.
Just to repeat that question, Alex.
What's the best vaccine to use with a quarantine drench for introduced stock?
Okay, it depends on what vaccines you're using on the rest of the flock. If you are using a vaccine containing cheesy gland, make sure that the vaccine you use as a quarantine vaccine contains that as well. Your 5 major clostridial diseases should be in that vaccine as well, so preferably a 6-in-1 vaccine.
Great, thank you, George. There's a follow-up question here. I'll just address this. 3-in-1 or 6-in-1?
Preferably 6-in-1. There's not a big cost difference between the two, and it just gives you that broader protection.
Great. Next question, should you use another short-acting drench at the end of an LA to clean up any resistant worms?
Yes, yep. It's definitely a good way to do it. So people have called that the tail cutter, I think, all those sort of things. So that's just to clean out any parasites that have stuck around during the long-acting period of that drench. It's a very, very good way to do it. And you want to come in with an unrelated, preferably a non-mectin or a mectin combination to try and knock out those worms that are still hanging around. Even if it's only low, it's still a good idea. And that just goes back to, if you're going to use a long-acting product, you make sure you use it correctly.
Great, thank you. And last question, is there a strategic time during the year we should complete an FEC?
Oh, a strategic time. No, well, FECs basically whether you need to do a tactical drench. So a tactical drench is the worms are already there, we need to do it. Whereas strategic drench is, say, like your first summer drench or your pre-lammer, you're going to drench pretty much regardless. So for a strategic effect, it just depends on the weather conditions, whether you've had that wet, warm weather, because that's going to determine whether you're getting the pasture or the pasture contamination from those eggs hatching. So that'd be my sort of thing. The time I'd look at maybe doing a strategic one, if you had to call it that, was if you're looking to do a fecal egg count reduction test.
Yes.
At a certain time of year, you do your fecal egg count first, because you want an egg count for scour worms over 300 or 400 eggs per gram to do a proper fecal egg count reduction test, where with barbasol we recommend over 600 eggs per gram. So that's when I'd be sort of looking at that, because there's no point doing a fecal egg count reduction test when your counts are way too low. So that's one way you could sort of look at it as strategic if you want to go and do the full fecal egg count reduction test.
And Tim, I think you went into more detail in our last webinar held in December last year as well. So guys, if you are interested in hearing more on FECRTs and drench resistance, you can head over to the Verbac Australia YouTube page and check that one out as well. Great, no, that's all the questions we've got. So thank you, everyone. As we've kind of alluded to, this is the first in a series of webinars Verbac will be running in 2020. To see a full list, you can follow the link now on your screen. If that comes up, there it is. The next webinar will be held on the 10th of March. And as we said earlier, we'll be talking about the importance of quarantine drenching. Here we'll address a few different questions like, what is a quarantine drench? Why is it so important to the future viability of your farm? What drench or drenches should I use to quarantine my farm? And what testing should I use to ensure my quarantine protocol is working? So you can either Google Verbac webinars, it should pop up first on Google, or you can copy and paste that link into your browser as well. You'll also receive an email tomorrow with more information on these webinars as well. But yeah, guys, thank you all for attending today. We hope you got a lot out of this session. Thank you, Tim and George, for your time this evening. A survey will pop up following this webinar. If you could please let us know your feedback. It'll be very much appreciated and help us improve and work on these webinars moving forward, because we do have many more plans to run more of these in the future. Please keep an eye out for the follow-up email that'll be sent to you tomorrow with all the important information from this webinar, including the details on the promotion I briefed you on earlier, and a full list of upcoming webinars and links to past webinars as well. But other than that, guys, thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, George. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your week, everyone. And we'll leave it there. But thank you.